Our final keynote speaker is Keith Allred, who's the Executive Director of the National Institute for Civil Discourse, which is a leading national voice for reviving civility and enhancing problem solving across the partisan divide. Keith's background as the first professor of negotiation and conflict resolution hired by Harvard's Kennedy School of Government is an ideal fit for the position, but he was recruited to lead the institute primarily based on his experience leading an organization called Common Sense American. That's a great name for a great program. After a successful 5-year pilot in Idaho, Keith brought Common Sense American into NICD, where it continues to see great success in bringing Republicans, Democrats, and independents together from across the country to find and champion legislative solutions. Keith will speak for about 15 minutes, and then we'll have a chance to ask a couple questions with the conversation. So please welcome to the stage, Keith.
Thank you, Governor Cox, and thank you, Governor Polis. This has been a spectacular day. I have just thoroughly enjoyed it, and this is a spectacular initiative, so crucial at this time in our country's history. And I can't think of a better group than our nation's governors leading us in this conversation, in conversation with all the rest of us that are involved in this. So it's a real honor to be with you today. I'd like to open the aperture a little bit on our discussion, not only on healthy conflict on campuses, but on this Disagree Better initiative overall, and give a broader historical context for why this is so important, not just because we are in extremely polarized times, but how timeless this is for the project of American democracy. And then bring that back to focus it particularly on college campuses and its relevance there. And so to do that, I want us to try to get in that perspective. We've invoked the founders several times already today, and I'd like us to kind of take a moment to really try to put ourselves back and think about looking out at the world and seeing what it looked like to them. They were looking out at a world that had seen dozens of attempts at self-government over the preceding 3,000 years that had all failed. It was a record of abject failure. And they knew that history deeply. They'd studied it carefully. They knew it. And yet, they took on the most powerful empire in the world in order to take a shot at making something work that they knew hadn't worked before. And part of what I find so impressive about the founders is not just that that was so audacious to do that, but they took such a clear-eyed, practical problem-solving approach to it. They studied that history with the thinking, hey, we had better understand why it is that it has always failed, and then have a better answer for it, or else we will suffer the same fate. And so as they looked at that history of failure, they came to an overwhelming consensus of why republics always failed. And their conclusion was the pattern that they observed is that as soon as you put the ultimate power in the people, then different groups will form trying to drive the government in different directions. And the contention that ensues among those groups makes the government so incompetent and unstable that it opens the door for despotism to come back in. This is the pattern they saw over and over again, and it's primarily what they were trying to solve for. So you really cannot understand the American Constitution or its intended institutions without understanding, first and foremost, they were trying to create a system that would be robust to what they called the spirit of party. So, and when they said spirit of party, we don't really have a common term today that's quite a synonym for that. Closest thing we have is partisanship. But by spirit of party, they were really emphasizing the kind of angry, emotional, vengeful part of differences. That's what they saw as so dysfunctional. And that's what they were setting out to address. So I want to, instead of me just offering that conclusion, I think it's worth taking a minute just to hear their own words and listen to the kind of language they use. You can feel them just struggling to find words strong enough that are adequate to the depth of their concern and focus on this. So we'll start with George Washington and his farewell address. And he said, "The spirit of party in those governments of the popular form is seen in its greatest rankness and is truly their worst enemy. The alternate domination of one faction over another, sharpened by the spirit of revenge natural to the spirit of party, is itself a frightful despotism." It's as though George Washington was watching cable news last night. John Adams, second president. "There's nothing I dread so much as a division of the republic into two great parties, each arranged under its leader and concerting measures in opposition to each other. This, in my humble apprehension, is to be dreaded as the greatest political evil under our Constitution." Can you feel how they are reaching for language strong enough to convey the depth of their feeling about this? Thomas Jefferson said, "I never submitted the whole system of my opinions to the creed of any party of men where I was capable of thinking for myself. Such an addiction is the last degradation of a free and moral agent." And Jefferson may be the first master of the soundbite. "If I could not go to heaven but with a party, I would not go there at all." We've referenced Jeff Rosen already referenced Madison as being particularly important in this conception of the American Republic, considered the father of the Constitution. And he put it this way: "Among the numerous advantages promised by a well-constructed union, none deserves to be more accurately developed than its tendency to break and control the violence of faction. The friend of popular governments never finds himself so much alarmed for their character and fate as when he contemplates their propensity to this dangerous vice." The instability, injustice, and confusion introduced into the public councils have in truth been the mortal diseases under which popular governments have everywhere perished. This is why republics fail. So you cannot understand the American Constitution without understanding this is first and foremost what they were trying to solve. So they are thinking about how do we create a structure, institutions, and this Jeff and others were making this point, how do we set up a set of institutions that are robust to this, that allow us to have the kind of dialogue and deliberation that will be necessary for this to work. And primarily, their protection against the spirit of party was to erect defensive barriers to any one party imposing their will on everyone else. So this is the reason that the American founders take separation of powers further than it had ever been taken before, further than it has been taken since. We are exceptional in the degree to which we take separation of powers, and this is the reason, is to erect defensive barriers so no one party can impose their will on everyone else. It's also the other big pillar of the structural solution was really led by Madison in arguing that we should erect a republic over a large and diverse people. Now here, Madison is turning 3,000 years of conventional wisdom on its head. From Aristotle to Montesquieu, the argument had been, if self-government has a shot at working, which they mostly didn't think it did, it was only on a very small scale among a very homogeneous group of people. If the dig on republics is they tear themselves apart across differences, well then reduce the amount of differences. That was the thinking. It's a fairly compelling, intuitive argument, right? Madison comes along and says they've got it 180 degrees wrong. A republic will work better on a big, diverse scale. And you do have to scratch your head a little bit and say, for real? And so I want to just go to what I think might be the most important sentence in all of the 85 Federalist Papers, where Madison, I think, most clearly maps out this argument. And it is the foundation for much of what we've said today. He says, in the extended Republic of the United States, and among the great variety of interests, parties, and sects which it embraces, a coalition of a majority of the whole society could seldom take place upon any other principles than those of justice and the general good. Now, I think Madison was a genius. I'm a big Madison fan. Writing simple, succinct sentences may not have been his greatest gift. So that's a pretty ponderous sentence. So I've had to do a kind of modern American English translation for myself on this, and I call it a common sense principle that he is articulating here. And I'm playing with the term common sense. He's saying that a sense held in common across our divides is a good indicator of wisdom. Broad support indicates wisdom. It's politically expedient. You can't have one party imposing its will on everyone else, or it creates chaos. But he's arguing for a deeper kind of wisdom, and it's one we've been noting today. And that is that you're going to come to better ideas, better solutions, if you have to do it within the context of differing views. And so it's a pretty subtle argument. You really have to read Federalist number 10 to fully get it. We've talked about confirmation bias today, too. Madison anticipates confirmation bias research by 200 years in Federalist number 10 when he says, our reason attaches itself to our self-love. And he says, and there is the seeds of faction are sown in the nature of man because we have this confirmation bias among other biases. But then now, if you put that together with Federalist number 51, he's saying, so in a country with so many different interests that are so countervailing, if a solution emerges that can attract broad and diverse support, it's hard to explain it away in terms of mere self-interest. It is likely to be for reasons that transcend self-interest, reasons like justice and the general good. This is a deep intellectual foundation on which we rest, and I would argue is the core pivot point for world history. That this is what changes the arc of world history from self-government being a laughingstock to the dominant form of government in the world, is to figure out how to embrace differences and make that a virtue. And in this very counterintuitive argument where he's turning conventional wisdom on its head. So this whole conception then, on which the uniqueness of the American experiment rests, creates an imperative. It creates a disagree better imperative. So by design, the defensive barriers require healthy conflict. We find the intended common sense solutions by engaging our differences on the merits. And Governor Cox, you have been very articulate about this. That is not a go along to get along attitude. That's not concede your convictions at the door. When you do that, you rob the Madison principle of its power. It is that rigor of contending perspectives, of deep convictions that has us reaching for better ideas. And so if we just concede, go along to get along, we don't get the value of it. So it does require us to engage those differences, but to do it on the merits of the ideas rather than the kind of ad hominem attacks, the anger, which keep us from engaging on the merits themselves, listening for where there is merit and what the other side is arguing, but also saying, no, I really don't agree with you there. We got to search for another idea if we're going to agree, or a refined idea. So to pull that then to college campuses and the discussion of today, in diagnosing the spirit of party as the main threat to self-government, the founders, of course, aren't coming up with that themselves. That had been the diagnosis for republics stretching back to classical antiquity, that they tear themselves apart across differences. And that notion of here's what's challenging about republics and what would be needed is also the deepest sources of our ideas about universities. Stretching back again to classical antiquity was the notion that we need to be able to come and understand and engage differences constructively. That is at the heart of the idea of the university. And so that has always traditionally been at the core of the college experience. So that's my effort to sort of ground this conversation in some deeper, timeless, historical thinking and trends, but to now pull us back again into the circumstances that we face today. From the time of the founders, this notion of disagree better has become obviously far more critical than ever for many of the reasons we've talked about. One, because of our constitutional structure. Since the founding, this has been an imperative that we do this. Second, the nation is unimaginably larger and more diverse than it was at the founding. To be honest, right, when Madison's talking about that rigor, he's talking about white males, 25 and older, who owned property. We are a country of over 300 million, teeming with diversity now. That raises the stakes of the ability to engage differences constructively to make this whole thing work far, far more difficult than it was 250 years ago. And then in the last 40 years, it's been the swell of toxic polarization that we've seen that I think is the most immediate motivation for the initiative that NGA has launched. But that's only the most recent version of it, but especially critical since it's the point on which the founders were warning us, if we fail, this will be the point on which we fail. And if you look at the formal research on polarization, which has been mentioned several times today, we are at one of the points of greatest polarization in our history. And for polarization along party lines, even greater than the Civil War was. And those kind of partisan polarization, given our constitutional structure, creates especially grave dangers. So for all the American generations that have been caretakers for this unique system of government, on our watch, this point that the founders most warned us about, our generation has the worst record. It is a critically important initiative that NGA is leading on this. So bringing that to college campuses then, the notion of a university is deeply connected to the same ideas that the founders were drawing on, that you've got to be able to engage differences constructively. So there's a real connection, as we've noted, between universities and trying to make self-government work. And so that should make it clear that preparing students to engage differences is essential for their civic lives, especially in the unique American system. But it's also critical for their personal and professional lives. By explicit thinking and design, as Madison argued, they will live out their personal and professional lives in one of the most diverse, not only republics, political systems, most diverse politically, but also the most diverse culturally and economically as well. That is the context within which they will live out their personal and professional lives. You simply can't be successful in the highly diverse, pluralistic American society without being able to engage differences constructively. And so we will send our students out into that incredibly diverse, but also highly polarized nation. And it is absolutely imperative that we prepare them to do that effectively. I couldn't be more appreciative of the governors taking this on. So let me stop there and open it up for questions. While you're thinking about questions, let me just note that the University of Arizona, or the Board of Regents in Arizona, so the National Institute for Civil Discourse is a unit actually of the University of Arizona. We're based in DC, but a unit of the University of Arizona. Board of Regents in Arizona recently passed new gen ed requirements, general education requirements that we were just talking about. And one of them is American institutions. And so I've been asked to help develop a course that this is the organizing theme to say you cannot understand American institutions without understanding this was the core consideration driving the shape of them, and it leads to this imperative that we engage differences constructively and that the course include practical skills building on how to do that. Governor Cox.
I wondered if you could talk a little bit, maybe two things. So one is institutions are so important. I'm an institutionalist. We're seeing kind of the decay of institutions. We're seeing what's happening with kind of Madison's worst nightmare, right? That these institutions are starting to fall apart. Maybe they didn't imagine every way in which this could happen. And after 250 years of pushing on the fences, we've found some holes in it. And then, if you could, maybe on the practical side of that, just talk about. We assume that when people get elected to office, that we endow them with some sort of new knowledge that they're just the same person the way they were the day before. How do we and your organization, how do we help those in political office kind of understand this and the important work you're doing?
Yeah, thank you for the question. Well, if I might, I mean, I'm a recovering professor, but I still relapse sometimes, so I always want to go to really unpacking the problem. And I think on the threat to the institutions, and this has also been noted several times today, how much the polarization is a threat to that. And what's new about it today, so we've been deeply polarized before in our time, but never so cleanly along partisan lines. So for a set of odd historical reasons in the United States, we've historically had two political parties that were ideologically diverse. We had liberals, moderates, and conservatives in both parties. In most of our lifetimes, we can remember conservative Southern Democrats and liberal Northern Republicans. That's no longer the case. So, Richard Hofstadter called the Constitution a constitution against parties. And then we pretty quickly grafted a two-party system onto it. That two-party system fit within the constitutional structure reasonably well as long as there was ideological diversity. So they themselves became engines for these Madisonian kinds of solutions, because to attract, to be viable on issues or as a candidate within your party, you had to be able to attract broad support because there was broad ideology within your party. And then the two parties could work together much easier because there was much more overlap. As we started to ideologically sort in the late 1970s for the first time in American history in any sustained kind of way, that has changed. And so now the parties have become much more directly an anathema to what Madison was talking about, where they are hell-bent on imposing their will on everyone else. It's about 30% of the country that clearly identifies with Democrats, about 30% with Republicans. It will never work, particularly in our constitutional structure, for 30% to impose their will on the other 70%, right? And so that's the threat to the institutions, I think, is a party structure that's really deeply and systemically different. And so I think it does require some institutional innovations to deal with that. Ranked choice voting was mentioned as one of those that I think that we need to do. So there's institutional reforms. I was really encouraged to hear from Jeff Rosen that agreement on 5 or 6 constitutional amendments. So we probably need to kind of focus on that more. But to your question about for people who are elected to office, they don't transform the day after the election. For one thing, I think we've just really got to teach them about this history of what led to the American success was this understanding. And the shorthand I put for it is, given that negative human emotions are about the strongest motivator, you can win elections by stirring the pot of divisions. But as soon as you win, you will take an oath to defend a constitution which purposely makes it impossible for you to govern that way. You can win elections, but you cannot govern that way. The other shorthand I use is, the Constitution is designed to produce frustration for all if we engage it in a narrow partisan way. So to just say, look, you might have won office that way, but here's why it is structured the way it is. Here's why you're going to find it so frustrating if you're just trying to impose your partisan will on everyone else. The founders were purposely trying to frustrate that. So I think we've got to instill that knowledge in folks. And I know there are some, like, associations of cities and counties will have their kind of orientations to do that. NGA has that for new governors. We worked with the Modernization Committee in Congress on freshman orientation, which it used to be. They come to freshman orientation, they're just elected, and they get on buses that are partisan and go to different places. They don't even talk to each other, right? And so they're changing some of the things about freshman orientation to do this. Paul.
We've obviously talked a lot about higher education. I'd just be interested in your thoughts about how this fits in with secondary education. I think we often underestimate how willing and interested secondary students are in engaging our history in these important ideas.
Yeah, absolutely. Good question, Paul. So there's been, this previous panel was just so impressive of the kinds of things that they're doing at the level of middle school and high school and debate. I'm a former debater myself and really believe in what was saying. We also talked about civic education. And I think this does really inform not only that we've got to bolster how much we require civics in secondary education, but what needs to be in it. And it's like, okay, how does a bill become a bill? That's the what, but why? Why have we made it so difficult to pass a law in Congress? This is why. It's because Madison and the others were trying to force us to actually engage with each other on the merits, on the thinking that we'd have better ideas if we did that. So I'm an advocate for not just the what of civics, but the why that's got to be informed by this. Good. Yes.
A quick question. My name is Paul Galloway, so two Pauls back to back. But a lot of recent data shows that having a college degree is a significant predictor of which political party you're going to affiliate with. And I'd like to relate that to the idea of social identity theory. And how do we, and who's responsible for crafting kind of a civic identity that's in common amongst our diversity?
Yeah, that's a deep question. You ask a former professor that, I'm tempted to really relapse and go in depth on that. And my training's in social psychology, so social identity theory gets me thinking. Well, one is, I think the research that the panel before us cited is that it's not clear that college students come out with a different ideology than they went in with, right? So it's not that the colleges are giving them that identity. They're coming into it. So there's a little bit of a sorting going on in who's going to college. And Governor, your point about where higher ed is going and community college and certificate programs, et cetera. So I think we've got to think about that part. Particularly your point makes that important. But I do think this social identity theory, that's where this sense of tribalism of this is my tribe, and that's what's given it the spirit of party, the kind of toxic element, and thinking through how that plays in it. So there's the college education part, but one of the big changes we've had is that in the 1950s, 1960s, if you knew what someone's race was, if you knew whether they lived in a rural or urban area, if you knew how often they went to church, it told you almost nothing about their party affiliation. Now it's highly, highly correlated. So first, we stacked our ideological identities on top of our party identities in a way that was unusual in American history. And then we started to stack these other social identities on top of that. And that gives it that this is defining who I am socially, and I've got to protect my tribe against that dangerous other tribe. So I think that really is part of it. And so, I was also encouraged by the point made today about the victory of how recent true diversity on college campuses is. So I actually think that's going the right direction, that we're becoming more diverse on college campuses, and that makes them an opportunity to say, hey, let's create good relationships across these various tribes in the country, because we don't have that, the big sort. We live in neighborhoods that are more sorted. We aren't getting that as much. So universities' role in trying to cultivate good relationships, the way you talked about your college experience, Governor Cox, that has got to be even more important in colleges today than it was before. Good. We're beyond time, but I do want to say what a pleasure it is to be shoulder to shoulder with all of you in this absolutely essential work. This is a battle and an initiative worth engaging in. Thank you very much.